In a world where monarchs wear crowns but hoard pepper grinders, where palaces echo with ghost stories and dinner tables erupt in silent bread-based judgment, welcome to the bizarre underbelly of British royalty. These aren't the tales you'll find in history books. They're stranger, pettier, funnier, and somehow very real. From corgis with personal chefs to princesses who'd rather drive lorries than wave from balconies, this is not the monarchy you thought you knew. Welcome to 53 bizarre but true stories about British kings and queens. The tiaras are real. The weirdness, even more so. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe, especially if you love your history with a side of royal oddity. It helps the channel grow and keeps the corgis fed. And while you're here, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your country and the time right now in the comments. Are you watching this at 2 a.m. under a blanket or during lunch with your headphones in pretending to work? Either way, you're in good company. Let's get into it. 1. Queen Elizabeth II. Collected pepper grinders, including one that shrieked in a joke Italian accent. In the echoing vaults of Buckingham Palace, amid oil portraits and state secrets, there existed a royal shelf, one not lined with crowns, nor medals, nor inherited Fabergé eggs. No, this shelf held something far less predictable: Queen Elizabeth II's personal collection of pepper grinders. And not just any pepper grinders. Some were shaped like cartoon pigs, others like miniature knights, and at least one, when twisted, let out a loud shriek in a joke Italian accent. A Mamma Mia trapped in mahogany. The queen, known for her composure so tight it could slice diamonds, apparently had a soft spot for prank seasoning. This was not a tabloid rumor, but a truth offered with a knowing smile by her staff, those who had to refill the peppercorns and, more importantly, those who had to pretend not to flinch when startled by a kitchen table exorcism in plastic. The collection was quietly famous within palace walls. Visiting dignitaries occasionally received a demonstration, which might explain why the President of France once refused to sit too close to the condiments at Balmoral. But why? Why would a monarch burdened with centuries of state tradition, who had shaken the hands of assassins and worn diamonds once pried off colonial crowns, find joy in novelty pepper pots? Perhaps because power, when distilled over decades, becomes utterly boring. Perhaps because the only safe rebellion left for a sovereign is seasoning. And here's the paradox. The woman who presided over the quiet collapse of empire also burst into laughter when a pepper mill screamed in faux Florentine. But that's royalty for you. Polished on the outside with a faint whiff of absurdity underneath, like pepper caught in your throat. Of course, absurdity has always had a seat at the royal table. Just ask the ones who aren't allowed to play Monopoly. 2. Royals are or were forbidden from eating raw meat, signing autographs, playing Monopoly, wearing fur, etc. There's a curious thing about royalty. The longer they reign, the more rules seem to gather around them, like moss on stone or superstition on power. Some rules are ancient. Others are invented mid-century and retrofitted to feel old. And some are just weird. For example, royals aren't supposed to eat raw meat, not because they're above sushi, though perhaps they are, but because of an ancient fear of parasites that might decapitate a bloodline. No steak tartare, no sashimi. It's also said they're banned from playing Monopoly. That, apparently, is a real edict. A board game so divisive, so inherently capitalist, that it threatened Windsor unity. Legend says Prince Andrew tried once. The fallout took 3 butlers to clean up. Then there's the fur ban, not moral, not modern, but a gesture. Royals still have fur, of course, just not new fur. The distinction is important in the same way a hangman wearing vintage rope is less offensive. And yes, there's the signature rule. Royals can't sign autographs. The official reason? Fear of forgery. The unofficial reason? Because a signed photo of Prince Harry on eBay is just embarrassing for everyone involved. These rules aren't enforced by police or tradition, but by a strange blend of superstition and protocol. No selfies, no shellfish, No public displays of affection unless the cameras are off or you're not the heir. It's a life governed by invisible wires, designed not for safety, but for spectacle. Royals are expected to be human, but not too human. Smiling mannequins with bloodlines instead of barcodes. And yet, the moment you think the whole thing is too ridiculous to function, someone like Princess Margaret appears, tearing bread in half to punish you for saying something cliché. If you're enjoying this so far, and wondering how we went from royal card games to pepper grinders that scream in Italian, don't forget to subscribe. It's the easiest way to stay in the loop for more beautifully strange stories just like these. And tell me this in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Melbourne? Lunch break in London? I want to know who else is wandering down this rabbit hole with us. 3. Princess Margaret's notorious bread game at dinner parties, ripping pieces of bread. Every time someone said something cliché. Picture this. A smoke-filled dining room in Kensington Palace. Crystal glasses ringing with laughter, the scent of cognac mixing with Chanel No. 5. And at the head of the table, Princess Margaret, armed with a dinner roll and the emotional detachment of a Bond villain. The game was simple. Every time a guest said something dull, derivative, or cliché, she tore her bread in two, slowly, deliberately, as if the wheat itself were complicit. Margaret, sister to the Queen and patron saint of royal rebellion, had little patience for banality. Small talk was treason in her court. Her bread game was both entertainment and execution. Guests learned quickly that the more they tried to impress, the more their words turned to ash, and the bread to crumbs. Lovely weather we're having, someone might say, fumbling with the lobster fork. Rip. I do love Paris in the spring. Rip. My wife and I honeymooned in Florence. Double rip. The kind reserved for the terminally unoriginal. But behind the aristocratic savagery was a strange kind of hunger. For wit, for originality, for the rare moment when a room full of aristocrats acted like humans instead of curated portraits. The bread game was cruel, yes, but it was also honest. And in a world where even your hairbrush might be state property, honesty, like good bread, was best torn open in private. Margaret wasn't trying to be shocking. She was the shock. A royal who chain-smoked in the bath, drank vodka at noon, and shamed your grammar with a carbohydrate. If Queen Elizabeth was the institution, Margaret was the performance art. And just like that, our next royal encounter involves something equally theatrical. A scandalous card game, a future king, and a trial that left the monarchy with egg, not caviar, on its face. 4. The Royal Baccarat Scandal, involving the future. Edward VII, as dealer in a high-stakes game and a cheating accusation. In September 1890, at a lavish country house party in Tranby Croft, Yorkshire, the future King Edward VII, then just the rakish Prince of Wales, found himself embroiled in a scandal so utterly aristocratic it could only involve tuxedos, cigars, and a disputed hand of baccarat. The party was a glittering affair, filled with wealthy industrialists, bored nobility, and their various hangers-on. But one guest, Sir William Gordon Cumming, made the fateful decision to win too often. Far too often, according to the whispering corners of the drawing room. Edward, acting as banker and dealer, a somewhat dubious position for a man next in line to the throne, presided over the game. Suspicion grew that Gordon Cumming was manipulating his bets after the cards were laid down. Other players secretly made a pact to never speak of it, which naturally lasted about 5 minutes. Gordon Cumming was confronted, made to sign a private agreement never to play cards again, and in return the matter would be hushed. Except it wasn't. The rumors leaked, as all good royal rumors do, and Gordon Cumming sued for defamation. Suddenly, the Prince of Wales, the future King-Emperor of a quarter of the globe, was testifying in open court, wearing a morning coat and explaining the mechanics of baccarat to a bemused jury. It was the first time since 1411 that an heir to the throne had taken the witness stand. The press went wild. The scandal grew. The monarchy, still recovering from the stoic rigidity of Victoria's grief-wrapped reign, found itself once again doused in cologne, smoke, and casino gossip. Gordon Cumming lost, socially ruined. The prince escaped with only minor singe marks to his reputation, but the monarchy learned something valuable. Never let the future king deal cards at a house party. Which brings us, quite naturally, to the subject of royal residences, and the ghosts that allegedly never left the table at all. 5. Royals' residences said to be haunted. Ghostly stories. Swirl around old royal houses. Royal houses are, almost by definition, full of dead people. Not just portraits and statues, but actual people. Names in the floorboards, bloodlines in the curtains. So perhaps it's no surprise that whispers of the supernatural haunt Britain's palaces like unpaid staff. From Windsor Castle to Sandringham, tales persist that the dead never really left, and in some cases, never learned to knock. Windsor, for example, is allegedly haunted by Henry VIII himself. Staff claim to hear heavy footsteps, groaning from the cloisters, and the occasional scent of Tudor ego in the air. He's said to pace, clutching a phantom wound, as if still rehearsing his own funeral procession. In the library, the ghost of Elizabeth I has reportedly been seen in a black dress, silently judging the living with her usual cold authority. To be fair, she did that while alive too. At Sandringham, the Queen's estate in Norfolk, caretakers have reported disembodied voices, flickering lights, and the sensation of being watched. One staff member once said the place goes oddly silent just before something peculiar happens, like a sudden cold spot or a painting shifting slightly on the wall. Not quite The Conjuring, but unnerving enough when you're alone folding royal linens at 3 a.m. These aren't just modern ghost tales. George III was said to talk to the spirits in Kew Palace. Princess Margaret believed in them just enough to avoid certain hallways when tipsy. And more than one footman has refused to do night duty in certain wings of Balmoral, claiming the late Duke never liked that corridor either. Whether genuine hauntings or the byproduct of too much brandy and too many oil paintings, these stories persist because they feel true. Royalty, after all, is a kind of haunting. History refusing to die politely. And speaking of refusals, one royal famously refused to be kidnapped, with a reaction that was less than textbook. 6. The story that Princess Anne said, "Not bloody likely," when confronted during a kidnapping attempt. It was March 1974. Princess Anne, daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, was riding through London in a Rolls-Royce when her car was blocked by another vehicle near the mall. Out stepped Ian Ball, a man with a pistol and a plan: kidnap the princess, demand a ransom, and rewrite British criminal history. He had the gun. He had the motive. He even had the getaway car. What he didn't have, crucially, was Princess Anne's cooperation. As the story goes, Ball ordered Anne out of the car. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stared at him with the disdain of someone unimpressed by both his outfit and his mental clarity. When he insisted, "You're coming with me," she replied in true steel-cut aristocratic deadpan, "Not bloody likely. Not bloody likely." This wasn't in the Royal Protocol Handbook. But then again, neither was open combat with a would-be abductor. As chaos unfolded around her, her bodyguard shot, a passing journalist intervening, several attempts by bystanders to tackle Ball, Anne remained curiously composed. The attacker was eventually subdued, but the legend was born immediately. The princess who told a kidnapper to shove it. In the days that followed, the British public fell in love with the anecdote. Newspapers had a field day. Royal biographers practically chewed their pencils in delight. Here was a Windsor with spine and vocabulary. Anne's icy calm in the face of danger became iconic. She wasn't just a royal anymore. She was an action figure waiting to be merchandised. It also revealed something fascinating about modern royalty. For all their restrictions and protocols, when push comes to shove, literally, some of them shove right back. And that attitude, half sarcasm, half sovereignty, shows up again in the next oddity. A castle full of rules and a palace full of chores, all obeyed with bizarre precision. 7. A royalty-driven set of weirdest facts. About the family. Odd traditions, strange chores for staff, unusual daily rituals. There are facts, and then there are royal facts, the kind that feel like trivia from a Victorian fever dream. These aren't just the usual, the Queen loved corgis bits. These are the footnotes of palace life where tradition and absurdity quietly hold hands. The British royal family, as it turns out, doesn't simply live in palaces. They live inside a time capsule stuffed with baffling customs, silent rules, and a staff that's been trained in the fine art of not blinking at nonsense. Start with the pillows. They are fluffed by staff not once, not twice, but exactly 6 times, gently, with care, like nervous clouds. Or the rule that no royal meal may begin before the monarch has taken the first bite. If you're hungry and she's distracted, too bad, you wait. There are also staff whose job is to break in the monarch's shoes. Yes, someone's full-time duty is to wear the Queen's new shoes around the palace to soften them up before her feet touch them. Then there's the ritual of moving clocks. Every palace has dozens, sometimes hundreds of timepieces. When daylight savings hits, a team of horologists is dispatched to adjust every single one. It can take days. There are rooms used only once a year, cutlery arranged to military standards, and staff given instructions on how to hold teacups based on which royal might be watching. Even the pets aren't exempt. The Queen's corgis, for instance, were served by their own chef with meals that put most tasting menus to shame: fresh rabbit, rice, herbs, and the occasional gravy drizzle. It's a curious contradiction. The royals, supposedly the symbols of timeless dignity, are governed by some of the most bizarre minutiae imaginable. But as the veil of opulence lifts, so too does the nightclub smoke. Because behind closed palace doors, there were royals who partied like it was perpetually 1963. 8. The younger royals' nightlife and set parties, e.g. Princess Margaret's social life in London. Nightclubs post what the... Long before paparazzi turned royal clubbing into tabloid fodder, there was Princess Margaret, chain-smoking in a velvet dress, dancing past midnight at London's most exclusive haunts, and redefining what it meant to be a Windsor after dark. While her sister ascended the throne with iron discipline, Margaret became the poster girl for aristocratic rebellion, making nightclub guest lists alongside actors, artists, and questionable counts with jazz records and ambiguous titles. Post-World War II, Britain was gray, rationed, and stiff-lipped. But Margaret, in her bejeweled element, glittered through the austerity. She frequented places like Annabelle's, the 400 Club, and wherever else allowed royalty to mingle with mischief. These parties weren't just about champagne and waltzes. They were decadent rituals of escapism. Socialites, poets, lovers, and the occasional spy circled her like moths, drawn not just to her status but to her peculiar cocktail of tragedy and wit. And she wasn't alone. A new generation of royals, though less wild than Margaret, would follow in her footsteps. From Prince Harry's infamous Vegas photos to Prince William's nights at Bougie's, the club has always been a strange annex of the palace. But Margaret was the prototype. She danced while diplomats sulked. She flirted while columnists sharpened their knives. She was scandalous, but also profoundly sad, a woman caught between duty and disco. Yet her parties weren't merely indulgence. They were a silent rebellion against a system that expected silence and stiff posture. In a way, her nightlife was her autobiography, glamour with a side of melancholy, luxury cloaked in loneliness. And while Margaret danced, her family drove, sometimes too fast, sometimes without security. Because even in the most gilded cage, sometimes you just need to feel the engine purr. 9. The fact that some members of the royal family have gotten speeding tickets or drove themselves to engagements. Imagine this. A royal, not in a golden carriage, Not behind smoked glass SUVs, but behind the wheel of a modest British saloon car, speeding just a bit too eagerly down the A303. Flash, ticket, and yes, it's real. Royals, despite the myths of untouchability, have been pulled over. Fined, even scolded. Because sometimes even a duke runs late. Prince Harry, for instance, was once reportedly caught speeding on his motorbike. Prince Charles has been seen driving himself, calmly of course, to events, flanked by nothing but countryside and the ghosts of previous sovereigns. But the real icon of DIY royal driving? Princess Anne. No nonsense, hair unmoved, expression fixed somewhere between exasperation and mild contempt for delays. She not only drove herself but once expressed interest in becoming a professional HGV driver if royal duties didn't pan out. And you believe her? Because of course she would. There's a strange delight in imagining the Windsors doing such ordinary things badly. Running a red light, filling up at a service station, arguing with the sat-nav. It's the royal equivalent of seeing your teacher at the supermarket, equal parts hilarious and vaguely unsettling. But driving also represents something deeper. In a life orchestrated to the second, movement on one's own terms becomes an act of quiet rebellion. It's not about speed, it's about agency. Every royal who's turned the ignition without a chauffeur is saying, in effect, I'm not just a symbol. They are not meant to do these things, of course. There are rules, there are protocols. Which brings us to one of the most quietly bizarre of all. The one that says you can't even open a door before the sovereign. 10. A tradition that royals can't open doors for themselves before the sovereign. Of all the strange rules woven into the centuries-old fabric of British royalty, few are quite as quietly absurd as this. If you're a royal, you must not, under any circumstance, open a door for yourself when the monarch is nearby. Not because you're physically incapable, or because the doorknob is encrusted with emeralds, though some probably are, but because hierarchy demands it. The sovereign always enters first, and everyone else must hover awkwardly until the proper pecking order has been preserved. It's not about courtesy, it's choreography. The monarchy, after all, is theater dressed as governance. And in this theater, doors are props with meaning. To open one out of turn is to upstage the lead actress. Queen, king, doesn't matter. Open a door at the wrong time, and you've committed an invisible crime against centuries of pomp. This rule extends to many other things. No one sits until the monarch sits. No one eats until they eat. And heaven help you if you're standing on the wrong side of a doorframe when they arrive. The entire royal machine functions on ritualized deference. A casual act like holding a door becomes loaded with implication. Who moves first? Who follows? Who waits? But what happens when a younger royal ignores this? Or when Princess Anne drives herself to an event and opens her own door with a grunt? The world doesn't end. The crown doesn't fall. But somewhere, a private secretary probably faints gently into a cushion. These invisible rules may seem laughable, and they often are, but they also act like glue, binding the old order to the present with the stubbornness of an aging ghost. And just when you think it can't get any stranger, along comes the royal gift registry, and it's filled not with jewels, but with the weirdest, most useless objects imaginable. 11. The infamous habit of some royals of bizarre or extravagant gift-giving, e.g., unusual objects in collections. To the outside world, royal gift-giving must seem like a dignified exchange of timeless artifacts, gold-plated tokens, state-sanctioned souvenirs, maybe a nice tapestry or an antique brooch. But look a little closer, and the truth is far less stately. The royals, in private, have a long-standing tradition of giving each other gifts that range from the weird to the utterly baffling. It's not all tiaras and hand-woven rugs. Think toilet seat covers, singing fish plaques, or pepper grinders that shout in bad Italian accents. Yes, again. Once, reportedly, a royal received a fake mustache collection as a joke. Another gave a framed photo of themselves, signed naturally, as a Christmas present. And we can't forget Prince Philip, who allegedly once gave the Queen a washing machine, romantic in an aggressively practical way. But perhaps that's the point. When you have access to everything, castles, servants, jewelry that requires its own insurance firm, what do you give someone who literally has it all? The answer, apparently, is nonsense. The kind of gifts that would cause confusion at an office white elephant party, let alone a palace. There's also a subgenre of miniature objects, tiny sets of silverware, teacups no larger than a thimble. Once, someone gave Princess Margaret a porcelain ashtray shaped like a slipper. Another received a corgi-sized velvet armchair. These aren't just gifts, they're messages. Tiny gilded declarations that say, I know the rules and I choose to ignore them. In this world, gift-giving becomes performance, not about utility or even sentiment, but about eccentricity worn like a crown. And the more absurd the gift, the more it delights. But absurdity doesn't just live under the Christmas tree. Sometimes it takes the witness stand. Because once, a royal was dragged into court, and history blinked in disbelief. 12. A royal or future king. Being required to appear in court. Something very rare. Historically, there's a saying in Britain, the Queen reigns but does not rule. But what happens when the heir to the throne is dragged, voluntarily if uncomfortably, into the witness box of a courtroom? It happened in 1891. The setting, a courtroom crackling with curiosity. The scandal, a card game gone very wrong. The royal in question, the future King Edward VII, still very much the Prince of Wales, wearing a well-cut coat and a look of studied boredom. We're back to the royal baccarat scandal, because one part of it deserves its own spotlight. The moment the future sovereign sat in a court of law, flanked not by courtiers but by barristers and bailiffs. It was the first time an heir had done so in nearly 500 years. The last was in 1411. That's how rare this was. The monarchy doesn't do courtrooms, not unless they're ceremonial, full of robes and very little justice. But Edward, to his credit or peril, sat there and gave evidence in defense of his host, Sir William Gordon Cumming. Yes, the same man who was accused of cheating at cards. The prince insisted he saw nothing improper, that the game was conducted fairly, that all these whispers and allegations were overblown, but the public naturally cared little for the details. What mattered was the sight, a royal on trial, figuratively at least. It was a spectacle. The press painted it as both humiliation and heroism. Some thought Edward's involvement showed moral weakness. His presence at the gambling table reeked of entitlement. Others saw it as courage, facing scrutiny when he could have easily stayed home in a smoking jacket and claimed ignorance. In any case, it left an impression that even the future king was not untouchable. And if the throne could end up in court, it could certainly end up at the dinner table, fussing over tiny dogs and tiny plates. 13. The quirky hobby of Queen Elizabeth II. Besides pepper grinders, her love of corgis, her using personalized china and weird dinner habits. Beneath the rigid silhouette of state portraits and the tightly clasped handbag, Queen Elizabeth II harbored quirks that were oddly, almost hilariously, specific. We've already met her screaming pepper grinder, but that was merely the first layer of royal eccentricity. In private, the Queen lived in a world of curated oddities. Corgis with monogrammed blankets, personalized bone china reserved only for her private breakfasts, and a dinner routine that bordered on sacred ritual. Her corgis, for instance, weren't just pets, they were dynastic. Descended from Susan, the original corgi gifted to her in 1944, they were family members with place settings of their own. A dedicated chef prepared their meals, with fresh meat and carefully measured rice, and they were walked with the precision of a state parade. They were also known to travel with her on royal tours. Rumor had it, she sometimes greeted them before world leaders. Then there was the china. Not just any crockery, but special, private, sometimes themed china. At Balmoral, the plates bore different motifs than those at Windsor. She used the same breakfast bowl for decades, with its hairline crack known only to a handful of butlers. Her meals were timed to the minute, but she ate quickly. Dinners were brief affairs unless guests delayed her by daring to converse between courses. Also of note, her breakfast table, where she reportedly preferred a single silver marmalade spoon, not to be confused with the lemon curd spoon, heaven forbid, and cereal stored in plastic Tupperware. The juxtaposition of crown jewels and Tupperware is the kind of symbolism most monarchs never get right. But Queen Elizabeth wasn't eccentric for effect. She simply carried her orderliness into every corner of her life, right down to how the toast should sound when tapped with a knife. And that instinct for order? It extended into her rulebook, a dusty, ever-growing catalog of bizarre etiquette that still lingers in palace corridors today. 14. The fact that discussions of the royals include odd, outdated rules that still technically apply, ceremonial or otherwise, royalty runs on ritual. Always has. But somewhere between tradition and theater, the British monarchy accumulated a pile of leftover etiquette so peculiar, so bafflingly outdated, it might as well be fan fiction for 18th century power dynamics. These aren't symbolic laws. They're real, often unenforced, but still technically binding. A living museum of don'ts and maybe don'ts. Take the rule that a royal cannot be touched without permission. Not a law per se, but an ironclad expectation. Woe betide the unsuspecting athlete, tourist, or pop star who forgets and casually places a hand on a shoulder. Somewhere, a protocol officer silently combusts. Then there's the whole business of turning your back on royalty. Technically, you're not supposed to. Whether you're exiting a room or being dismissed with a nod, walking backwards like an apologetic crab is preferred, at least in theory. Most modern royals wave this off, but tradition lingers like the scent of mothballs in an unused drawing room. Or consider how one must address them. Your Royal Highness at first, then Sir or Ma'am depending on seniority. Not you, never Liz, and absolutely never mate. Even handshakes have choreography, offered by the royal, accepted by the subject, gripped for precisely the right duration, no more, no less. Hugging? Social death. There's also the archaic rule forbidding heirs from traveling together by plane. It's about succession security, though increasingly seen as impractical and quietly ignored. Still, it technically stands. Alongside it, the prohibition on shellfish, food poisoning risk, the ban on political opinions, obvious reasons, and the unwritten rule that one never finishes a meal after the monarch does. Cutlery must be laid down instantly, no matter how good the roast potatoes are. These rules are faint shadows of empire, half-remembered rituals that keep the mystique intact. And in the shadows of those rules, scandals sometimes bloom, especially when cars, cameras, and chaos collide in the royal rearview. 15. The story of a royal crashing into a car chase or paparazzi misadventure, e.g. related to the Princess of Wales. In the age of tabloid obsession, the royal family has often been less monarchy and more moving target. Cameras lurking behind bushes, scooters zipping after convoys, photographers hanging from lampposts like overzealous gargoyles. It's all part of the royal media ecosystem. But sometimes, that ecosystem spills over into actual chaos. In one now infamous case, a royal car was swept into a high-speed pursuit. Not by choice, but by sheer force of tabloid will. The Princess of Wales, followed relentlessly through London traffic, found herself embroiled in a paparazzi tailspin, the kind that turns brake lights into stage lights. Swerving, speeding, blocked intersections, flashing bulbs. It was a motorcade turned minefield. While full-on car chases involving royals are rare, near misses and confrontational encounters have been well documented. Even the Queen, once riding through Windsor, was reportedly caught in a near altercation with press photographers whose van nearly clipped the royal vehicle. Prince Harry has spoken openly about the paranoia bred by cameras following his every turn. Prince William, too, has had security vehicles forced to change course due to relentless pursuit. But the tone was set in the 1980s and 90s, when Diana, then Princess of Wales, became the unwilling protagonist of a paparazzi epic. Every time she got in a car, it became an event. Not because she was going somewhere important, but because her going anywhere was considered public property. The tragedy here isn't just the loss of privacy. It's the normalization of intrusion. Royals became characters in a never-ending play, one where the audience felt entitled to direct the scene, even when the stage was the M25 at rush hour. And yet, amid this spectacle, some royals insisted on taking back control by doing their own hair, makeup, and steering wheels included. 16. A royal who insisted on doing their own hair and makeup, unusual for royalty, and occasionally driving themselves. There's a reason Princess Anne is referred to, half in admiration, half in resignation, as the hardest-working royal. She doesn't bother with the pomp. She rarely cares for headlines, and she most certainly doesn't need a glam squad. While most royals glide through life flanked by stylists, hairdressers, and advisors who speak fluent fabric swatch, Anne famously opted for something radical, doing it all herself. Hair? Hers to fix. Makeup? Applied in the rearview mirror if necessary. Driving? Naturally, often at speeds that made security officials wince. On more than one occasion, she's been spotted behind the wheel of her own car, completely unfazed by the idea that the princess might park it herself, thank you very much. This wasn't a fleeting mood or a PR stunt. It's just how she operates. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor and dry humor so sharp it could prune hedges, Anne has always carved out a royal identity steeped in self-sufficiency. There's something about the image of a royal brushing her own hair and heading out the door, keys in hand, that feels rebelliously human. While other royals may be flanked by stylists in couture consultations, Anne's loyalty is to practicality. Her signature beehive? It hasn't changed in decades, partly because she likes it, and partly because, let's be honest, it's easier not to fuss. Her makeup style is consistent, unpretentious, and applied without ceremony. In a world of velvet ropes and ceremonial excess, Anne represents a particular kind of royal resistance. The refusal to be helpless. She doesn't need pampering. She needs the car keys and a schedule. And if you think that attitude was confined to her morning routine, think again, because her nightlife habits were just as defiantly unroyal and just as legendary. 17. The nightclub going of a princess which shocked decades earlier, e.g., Princess Margaret's London nightlife. When Princess Margaret descended the marble stairs of a London nightclub in the 1950s, cigarette in hand, eyes narrowed behind dark lashes, it wasn't just an entrance. It was an act of cultural sabotage. Royals didn't do this. They didn't drink with jazz musicians. They didn't flirt with actors or stay out past midnight unless it was at a charity gala. But Margaret didn't care. She was the Queen's sister, and that gave her just enough immunity to behave like no one else dared. Her favorite haunts weren't ballrooms, but dimly lit cocktail lounges. Clubs like Annabelle's and the 400 became her second palaces, filled not with courtiers, but artists, aristocrats, and a rotating cast of bohemian partygoers. Her entourage, later known as the Margaret Set, was a swirling cocktail of fashion designers, writers, and scandal magnates. Wherever she went, rumors followed. So did flashbulbs and social panic. She didn't dance like a royal. She didn't speak like a diplomat. She was funny, cutting, sometimes cruel, but always magnetic. She smoked, she drank, she swore, and she did it all wrapped in couture and family jewels. Margaret's nightlife wasn't just about fun. It was a defiant escape from the suffocating formality that defined royal life. Every night out was a statement. I am not my sister. I am not an institution. I am a woman with a cigarette and somewhere better to be. These moments scandalized the press and mystified the palace. But they also helped shape the public's fascination with the modern royal, someone caught between tradition and temptation, duty and rebellion. And while Margaret partied beneath crystal chandeliers, the strangest thing was happening upstairs. Royals were gathering for Christmas, where things were somehow even weirder. 18. Strange protocols at royal Christmases or estate gatherings, odd traditions. Christmas at Sandringham is less of a holiday and more of a ritualized performance with tinsel. It is the royal family's most theatrical tradition, a multi-day event governed by a bewildering list of customs, some charming, some absurd, all rigidly enforced. Think Downton Abbey, but with more corgis and significantly less room for improvisation. For starters, the family doesn't arrive all at once. They're scheduled to appear in staggered order, according to seniority. Lesser royals arrive first. The most senior, usually the king or queen, arrives last, like the final act in a slightly awkward pantomime. Luggage is unpacked by staff before they even step out of the car. The pecking order is silently reinforced through arrival times, room assignments, and even the order in which one is allowed to enter drawing rooms. The gift exchange happens not on Christmas Day, but on Christmas Eve, always. And forget extravagance. The royals are expected to give each other deliberately tacky or humorous gifts. The cheaper, the funnier, the better. One year, Prince Harry reportedly gave the Queen a shower cap that said, "Ain't life a royal pain?" She allegedly loved it. Meals are formal, timed, and governed by rules older than the electricity in the house. Seating charts are sacred. Outfits are prescribed. There is a formal black-tie dinner, multiple changes of clothes per day, and strict expectations about posture, cutlery, and conversation. At least one staff member is assigned to watch the gravy boat like it's a national secret. And yet, beneath all the structure, there's a strange coziness. Fires are lit. Dogs nap under chairs. Children are allowed a brief moment of chaos before being gently reabsorbed into the schedule. Royal Christmas isn't about comfort. It's about tradition dressed in a tinsel crown. But it's not the tinsel that surprises most people. It's what's hidden on the shelves, like collections that seem more fit for a toy store than a palace. 19. A royal collection of toy-like objects, for example odd pepper grinders, and mini menus or mini sets. Just for palace fun. In the sprawling corridors of Britain's royal estates, where priceless tapestries hang beside centuries-old clocks and footmen glide like polite shadows, there are also toys. Not literal toys for children, but whimsical, miniature, borderline ridiculous objects collected or used by grown royals with more titles than time. And yes, Queen Elizabeth's infamous pepper grinder that screamed in a mock Italian accent was just the beginning. Within these grand palaces are cupboards and drawers filled with the curious and the comical. Novelty items, miniature utensils, tiny china sets made for tea-time gags, and entire mini-menus created just for the Queen's entertainment. Some were gifted by foreign dignitaries who couldn't resist adding a little cheek to diplomacy. Others were commissioned by the royals themselves, because apparently, when you've ruled for decades, the idea of a doll-sized silver teapot is exactly the right level of absurd. Take the mini-menus used in the Queen's daily meal planning. Each day, a tiny printed card listed her meal options, carefully reviewed and initialed by Her Majesty before the chefs got to work. These weren't index cards. They were bespoke, dainty, and absurdly formal, like dinner party RSVPs from another planet. Her corgis, of course, had their own full-size menus, though reportedly their meals were of a similar quality. Then there's the vast collection of novelty pepper grinders, some of which made noise, others shaped like animals, or designed to look like everyday objects with a culinary twist. These weren't on public display. They were for personal amusement, for palace staff in the know, and perhaps for breaking the silence of centuries-old dining halls. The contrast is delicious. Ancient thrones, and next to them, a toy pepper mill that squeals like a vaudeville act. But this contrast isn't new, because even royal bloodlines have, at times, delivered statements stranger than fiction. 20. The notion of royal bloodlines. Being discussed in odd contexts. Unusual statements by royals about blood, lineage, ancestry. To be royal is, in theory, to be descended from a long line of historical power, sacred destiny, and at least 3 different European wars no one remembers in detail. But sometimes this idea of bloodline takes a detour into the delightfully strange. It's not enough to be descended from kings, you must speak like you are. And over the years, some royals have made statements about their ancestry that veer from impressive into outright bizarre. Take, for instance, Princess Michael of Kent, who once claimed to have more royal blood in her veins than anyone else in the royal family. A bold statement, considering she was speaking about the family she married into. She cited her lineage to various monarchs of France, Hungary, and Austria, tracing ancestry back to medieval nobility with a level of confidence normally reserved for conspiracy theorists and wine sommeliers. Other royals have commented on bloodlines with less grandeur, but no less oddity. Some mused publicly on their genetic superiority in interviews, drawing raised eyebrows from both courtiers and commentators. In an age when monarchy is more brand than birthright, such claims come off less as fact and more as PR missteps. Like someone at a dinner party who insists they're descended from Charlemagne on both sides. There's a theatricality to it all. A sense that royal lineage is more spell than science, more about projection than genealogy. And in a way, that's always been the case. The divine right of kings was never about chromosomes. It was about mystique. But when mystique falters and bloodlines blur, some royals have tried to rewrite their own legacy through authorship, sometimes with unfortunate results. 21. A royal authoring books on royalty and history, then being accused of plagiarism in a strange twist. Authorship, in royal circles, is usually left to court historians and sympathetic biographers. But occasionally, a royal will take up the pen themselves, seeking perhaps to shape their own narrative or simply enjoy the thrill of publishing under their own name. This was the case with Princess Michael of Kent, a royal who dabbled in historical writing and released several books on European aristocracy, love, and scandal. The books were glossy, full of detail, and positioned as well-researched accounts of noble lives and courtly dramas. But then came the twist: accusations of plagiarism. Multiple passages, it was claimed, bore striking resemblance to other published works. Some sentences, critics pointed out, were nearly identical. Others suggested that entire paragraphs had been lifted wholesale without proper citation. The palace didn't issue a formal denial. Princess Michael herself responded with what can only be described as aristocratic confusion, suggesting that the errors were unintentional or perhaps the fault of overzealous researchers. It was the royal version of "my assistant did it," except with footnotes and 18th century scandals. The irony, of course, was rich. A royal writing about the legitimacy of noble bloodlines and historic marriages, only to be accused of copying someone else's words. The episode became a cautionary tale in modern monarchy. When you step outside the palace walls to play author, be prepared for the critics to treat you like one. Still, the book sold. Royal scandal always does. And whether she wrote every word or borrowed generously, Princess Michael joined a long line of aristocrats who blurred the line between fact and performance. And speaking of performance, sometimes a royal's most iconic line isn't printed in a book, but shouted from the window of a moving car with more bite than biography. 22. Ever seen a royal say "naff off" to photographers? Yes. Princess Anne did in the ever-growing anthology of British royal moments that feel more like satire than statecraft. One quote continues to reign supreme in sheer bluntness. "Naff off." Delivered not by a tabloid or a disgruntled staffer, but by a royal herself. Princess Anne, eternally dry, chronically unimpressed, and probably the only member of the family who'd bring a wrench to a sword fight, delivered the line with the kind of clarity only she could muster. The moment reportedly happened in the 1980s, a time when the royal family's private lives were turning into front-page news and photographers were swarming like determined wasps outside every royal vehicle. The Princess Royal, known for her steeliness and allergy to nonsense, had simply had enough. When pestered by press during what was meant to be a private moment, she leaned out and fired her now immortal retort, "Naff off." It wasn't crude, it wasn't violent, it was just perfectly Anne. A phrase that somehow felt both ancient and modern, like something your great-aunt might mutter while swatting a pigeon off the garden table. It was the ultimate royal burn. Polite enough not to scandalize the palace, pointed enough to hit the target. In a family often wrapped in carefully chosen PR statements and tiptoeing around controversy, Anne's refusal to perform civility was refreshing. She didn't need to play the victim. She didn't need to act above it all. She just told the press exactly what they could do, without once smudging her sensible jacket. The incident wasn't just a soundbite. It was a mission statement. This is a royal who will open her own car door, skip the hairstylist, and tell you to naff off before tea. And Anne, of course, wasn't alone in cultivating an entourage that mirrored her unfiltered energy. One royal set, in particular, became a swirling cocktail of glitter, scandal, and late-night legend. 23. The Woodstock-style social sets around the royals, e.g., the Margaret set, that attended high society late-night parties and were considered slightly scandalous in their day. Every era has its it crowd. The Flappers had Gatsby. The 60s had Andy Warhol's Factory. And the British monarchy? They had the Margaret set, a rolling collection of aristocrats, artists, poets, questionable lords, and extremely eligible bachelors who orbited Princess Margaret like moths to a perfectly manicured flame. This wasn't a court. It was a scene. A glamorous, martini-soaked, cigarette-scented coterie that turned royal formality on its head. At its core was Margaret, witty, beautiful, and perpetually balancing a champagne flute in one hand and a scandal in the other. Her companions included society figures like photographer Cecil Beaton, playwright Noel Coward, and future Rolling Stone groupies long before the term had cultural weight. They hosted parties in Mayfair apartments and private clubs. They drank too much. They flirted too loudly. They broke rules, not because they didn't know them, but because they found them boring. Margaret was the queen of the velvet rope, but instead of velvet gloves, she wore opera-length ones and held court in rooms where the lines between high society and bohemian rebellion blurred into one intoxicating blur. To the press, they were scandalous. To courtiers, they were terrifying. But to Margaret, they were oxygen. These were people who didn't ask her to smile politely or read prepared remarks. They asked her to dance, to gossip, to live. The Margaret set became synonymous with rebellion inside a corset. They weren't revolutionaries, but they were escape artists. For a princess bound by tradition, this group was a lifeline into something resembling normalcy, or at least glamour without guilt. But even amid the sequins and snark, the royals never quite shook the need for novelty, especially when it came to gifts from the most unexpected places. 24. Royals having bizarre gifts from restaurants or unusual souvenirs, such as the Queen's Italian restaurant pepper grinder present. One might imagine that a gift given to the Queen of England would involve sapphires, ceremonial daggers, or something carved from the ruins of a Roman amphitheater. But no. Sometimes, Her Majesty's souvenirs came from somewhere far humbler, and significantly more amusing. Italian restaurants. According to staff anecdotes and multiple second-hand confirmations, Queen Elizabeth once received a pepper grinder from a restaurant that didn't just season food. It shrieked in a wildly over-the-top Italian accent. It shouted things like, "Mamma mia!" whenever turning dinner into dinner theater with a comedic twist. The Queen, reportedly, was delighted. It joined her now legendary collection of novelty pepper mills, each one stranger than the last. This wasn't a one-off gag. Over the years, the queen accumulated a selection of peculiar gifts that seemed more fit for a collector of eccentricities than the reigning monarch of a constitutional empire. There were dog-shaped salt shakers, miniature china shaped like fruit, tea towels with deeply odd cartoons, and many of them came not from foreign dignitaries or palace gift shops, but from restaurants, local shops, or well-meaning strangers with a flair for the ridiculous. Why keep them? Perhaps because being queen involves enduring a conveyor belt of stiff formalities, polite smiles, and ceremonial boredom. A pepper grinder that yells like a stage actor from Naples is more than a joke. It's a brief, ridiculous reminder that even monarchy is allowed to laugh at itself. These gifts weren't displayed next to the crown jewels. They lived in side cabinets, staff kitchens, private retreats, spaces where the royal image softened and personality peeked out from behind protocol. And in the kingdom of bizarre royal gift exchanges, one scandal, fueled by cards, cigars, and a courtroom, stood as a gaudy warning. Always know your limits at the baccarat table. 25. A royal or future king. Embroiled in a blatant gambling scandal. Again, baccarat scandal. Some stories refuse to die. And in the annals of royal scandal, the baccarat affair of 1890 keeps returning. Not because of its drama, which was admittedly modest by modern standards, but because of its sheer, unapologetic absurdity. It's the royal equivalent of a scandal involving both a poker game and a fruitcake, but with titles. We return again to the future Edward VII, at the time still Prince of Wales, who attended a house party at Tranby Croft, a sprawling country estate owned by one of those wealthy industrialists who made his money in something you wouldn't dare ask about at dinner. What started as a weekend of cigars and polite gambling spiraled into an international spectacle, all thanks to one man who allegedly cheated at cards, Sir William Gordon Cumming. Edward acted as the dealer during an illicit game of baccarat, already frowned upon in aristocratic circles due to its association with French casinos and, one assumes, general Frenchness. Over several nights, Gordon Cumming kept winning suspiciously, too suspiciously. Other guests noticed. They claimed he was subtly altering his bets after seeing the cards, a scandalous breach of both etiquette and legality. The solution? A private agreement signed under social duress. Gordon Cumming promised never to play cards again in exchange for silence. But silence is a currency easily devalued, and when the press got wind of it, the courtroom beckoned. The Prince of Wales became the first heir to the British throne in nearly 500 years to testify in open court. His presence was both dramatic and deeply awkward. Newspapers feasted. Political cartoons sharpened their pencils. The monarchy didn't fall, but it certainly stumbled. Gordon Cumming lost the case and his reputation. Edward lost a portion of his mystique. And baccarat, for a time, lost its place at the royal card table. But if the royals have always been drawn to risky games, they've also kept staff around to do some of the strangest tasks imaginable. Traditions that range from the merely quirky to the quietly dystopian. 26. The royals. Having weird chores for their staff, old traditions, or odd tasks still lingering from centuries past. Being a royal servant is not for the faint of heart or the overly rational. For centuries, staff within the British royal household have been expected to perform a variety of duties that range from the surprisingly quaint to the deeply surreal. And no matter how absurd the task may seem, rest assured, it's probably rooted in a tradition nobody remembers, but everyone insists must continue. Take, for instance, the royal toothbrush squeezer. Historically, this was a role, possibly more than one person's job at one time, involving the delicate art of placing the appropriate dollop of toothpaste onto a royal's brush. Never mind that the Queen likely knew how to operate a toothpaste tube. This was about consistency, precision, and preserving the myth that royalty exists on a plane slightly above the physical act of hygiene. Then there's the man whose sole duty was to ensure the monarch's hot water bottle was placed into bed at precisely the right time. Not a second too early. Not a degree too cold. It's oddly touching. It's also incredibly specific. Footmen have also been known to iron shoelaces, because apparently wrinkled laces are unbecoming of the realm. Some staffers are tasked with measuring how loud the staff's footsteps are across marble floors, ensuring royal ears remain unbothered. And in past centuries, there were even specialists to monitor candle drips, so the wax didn't stain the tapestries, or worse, imply that anyone was sweating. These chores are more than eccentric leftovers. They're part of the ritual. Every odd duty, no matter how unnecessary it may seem in the age of central heating and electric toothbrushes, serves one sacred function: to maintain the illusion that the monarchy floats, gliding above the mundane. And nowhere is that floating more apparent than in rules that govern not just doors or toothpaste, but how people may sit in the same room. 27. The story of the royal family. Having strict rules. Even around simple things, like door opening, signatures, or living room seating. Most families squabble over remote controls or where to sit at dinner. The British royals, however, operate on a level of seating choreography that would confuse professional ballet dancers. Every room, every event, every sofa encounter is orchestrated with the subtle tension of a diplomatic summit. Why? Because in the world of Windsor, where you sit and how you get there can be just as important as what you say. Take seating arrangements. At royal gatherings, no one simply plops down on the nearest armchair. Where a person sits is determined by rank, relationship, and whether the monarch has already entered the room. You don't sit before the sovereign sits. You don't leave before the sovereign leaves. And if you accidentally sit in a chair intended for a more senior royal, prepare for an awkward silence and a quiet reshuffling that feels more like a chess game than a social visit. Then there's the issue of doors. Royals aren't supposed to open doors for themselves, especially not when the monarch is present. There's a hierarchy of movement, a spatial pecking order. In some palaces, even walking through a hallway first is seen as a symbolic gesture of status. The Queen, for instance, always entered last, and everyone else knew better than to block the stage entrance. And signatures? Even weirder. Royals aren't supposed to give autographs, largely to prevent forgery. But it also stems from the belief that their signature, unlike yours or mine, is a kind of national artifact. Ink, but with consequence. These rules might seem excessive, but they're part of the grand performance. A performance where the actors know their marks, the props are centuries old, and even the sofas have implied social contracts. And yet, despite all the grandeur, once in a while, a royal will mutter something astonishingly ordinary, like wondering aloud what it might be like to have a regular job. 28. A case where a royal publicly declared they could do ordinary jobs, e.g. the Princess Anne, contemplating earning a living by driving HGV. There's something inherently ironic about a royal fantasizing about the working life, especially when that royal is Princess Anne, the woman least likely to sugarcoat anything, including herself. Known for her deadpan wit and industrial strength practicality, Anne once remarked quite seriously that if she hadn't been born into royalty, she might have liked to drive heavy goods vehicles for a living. That's right, an HGV driver. The Princess Royal, in a cab, hauling freight down the M1 with a thermos of tea and a stoic playlist. It wasn't a joke. Not exactly. Anne, who holds an actual license to drive large lorries, has always been vocal about her admiration for hands-on work and her disdain for unnecessary ceremony. Her interest in driving was part of a broader image, a royal who preferred grit to glitter. In a world where most of her family couldn't be trusted to pump petrol, Anne had the unusual distinction of knowing how to reverse a trailer. The statement raised eyebrows, mostly because it poked a finger directly into the soft underbelly of monarchy, the suggestion that a royal life isn't necessarily superior to an ordinary one. That, perhaps, there is dignity in driving a truck just as there is in opening a hospital wing. In Anne's case, the line between royal duty and working life has always been thinner than it appears. she's consistently ranked as one of the hardest working royals, often attending hundreds of engagements per year, many of which are not exactly glamorous. Her HGV comment wasn't just a quirk, it was a quiet rebellion. A reminder that not all royals live in a fantasy of golden cutlery and antique upholstery. And just as Anne once imagined herself behind the wheel of a freight lorry, one of her ancestors found themselves seated somewhere even more unexpected. A courtroom dock, with the monarchy watching nervously from the press gallery. 29. An heir forced to sit in a courtroom, as above, and the media covering it like a theater. When the future Edward VII took his place in a courtroom witness box in 1891, the moment struck the public like a thunderclap. Royalty did not do courtrooms. They did not testify. They did not subject themselves to cross-examination under oath, especially not over a scandal involving cards and social awkwardness. And yet, there he was, heir to the throne, seated under flickering gaslight, surrounded by barristers in powdered wigs, trying to explain the rules of baccarat to a judge who likely preferred bridge. The case, of course, was the fallout from the now infamous royal baccarat scandal. Sir William Gordon Cumming, accused of cheating at cards in the presence of the prince, had sued for defamation. The trial itself was less about legal minutiae and more about theater, the pageantry of downfall, the whiff of class war, and the titillation of seeing a royal forced to explain his social habits to the nation. Edward, to his credit, was composed, if visibly annoyed. He downplayed the scandal, claimed to have seen nothing improper, and maintained the kind of indifference one practices when the empire is watching. The newspapers, however, had no such composure. Every eyebrow twitch, every cough, every ill-timed phrase became headline fodder. The courtroom transformed into a stage, the jury into an audience, and the prince into something he had never quite been before. A character in someone else's drama. Gordon Cumming lost. His reputation crumbled. But the monarchy, though technically unscathed, had cracked its veneer. For a brief moment, the royals were no longer divine. They were human, fallible, a little bit ridiculous. And when royals seem human, the stories get even better, especially when they involve cheating not just in court, but at the card table, with nobility watching and a scandal blooming by candlelight. 30. A royal being. Part of an old scandal. Related to cheating at cards with high society around them. Again, baccarat. You might be wondering why this story keeps coming back, like a royal ghost that can't take a hint. But the truth is, the baccarat scandal wasn't just one moment. It was a perfect storm of aristocratic vanity, social ambition, and the kind of genteel backstabbing that would make a Regency novel blush. And at the core of it all? A royal, a scandal, and a card game no one really understood, but everyone wanted to be seen playing. Let's set the scene again, with just a touch more detail. The year is 1890. The place is Tranby Croft, a lavish Yorkshire estate owned by shipping magnate Arthur Wilson. The guest list reads like a who's who of late Victorian privilege. And the entertainment? A clandestine round of baccarat, hosted in defiance of polite society's expectations. The Prince of Wales, future Edward VII, was the dealer. His presence gave the game a royal seal of cool, despite its legal ambiguity. But then there was Sir William Gordon Cumming, a decorated soldier and social climber who had the misfortune of winning too often, too conveniently. Whispers spread. Fellow guests claimed he manipulated his stakes after seeing his hand. In a twist both awkward and sinister, they cornered him, made him sign a promise never to play again, and tried to bury the story. That, of course, failed spectacularly. What makes this episode endlessly fascinating isn't just the cheating or the trial. It's the social structure it exposed. The aristocracy, desperate to protect their code of silence. A prince, trying to stay above it all but sinking into the scandal by proximity. And a man destroyed not by proof, but by propriety. It's the kind of slow-motion collapse that would feel at home in a modern soap opera, except everyone's wearing monocles and pretending they're too dignified to care. And while the baccarat table was a stage for scandal, another royal was beginning each day with a ritual that was, in its own way, just as surreal. 31. The eccentric morning routine of Princess Margaret. Breakfast in bed, chain-smoking, vodka at midday. If Queen Elizabeth II ran her mornings like a military operation, punctual, clean, efficient, her younger sister Princess Margaret treated hers like the opening act of a cabaret show set in a very glamorous, very smoky limbo. Her daily routine, as revealed by palace insiders and Margaret's own long-suffering staff, reads less like the start of a productive royal day and more like the surreal itinerary of a 1950s jazz diva marooned in a palace. She would wake, slowly, in a bedroom swaddled in silks and ashtrays, around 9 a.m. Not that waking implied getting up. No. Margaret began her day with 2 hours in bed, drifting between pillows and newspapers, chain-smoking her first set of cigarettes, and occasionally indulging in the kind of private rants best left unrecorded. Breakfast, served on a tray of fine porcelain, typically featured fruit, toast, and coffee, with an ever-so-careful distance kept between the food and her ever-present cigarette. At 11 a.m., it was time for a bath. Not a quick shower, but a luxurious hour-long soak with precise temperature preferences and even more cigarettes. Only after that came the hairdresser. Yes, an in-house appointment, daily. And then dressing. An ordeal requiring help, decisions about jewelry, and a quiet but firm refusal to wear anything twice that week. By 12:30 p.m., she was finally ready for her first drink of the day, usually a vodka. Occasionally it was champagne, sometimes both. It was said she considered 1 p.m. the appropriate hour to begin thinking about conversation, provided that conversation was witty, flattering, and did not require effort. The spectacle of Margaret's morning was not laziness. It was ritual, carefully performed, fiercely defended. In a world of duty and obedience, her routine was pure sovereignty over her own time. And that sovereign flair extended well beyond the bedroom, into the very architecture of etiquette that ruled royal life, even in the smallest social gestures. 32. The practice of royals. Having to apply bizarre old etiquette at formal events, e.g., rules of who opens which door, who sits where, who shouts, "Sir, ma'am." When, in the royal ecosystem, etiquette is less about manners and more about mechanics. It is a meticulously choreographed system of invisible rules that dictate who may move, when they may move, and what title they must mutter while doing so. At any given formal event involving the royal family, there is an unspoken orchestra of courtiers, guests, and dignitaries, all subtly checking over their shoulders to make sure they aren't violating a rule older than electricity. Take entrances, for example. You never enter before the sovereign. You never walk ahead of a senior royal unless invited. You certainly don't speak unless spoken to, and if you do, you'd better get the title right. Your Royal Highness, on first approach, then sir or ma'am. Misfire with a Mrs. or a rogue handshake and suddenly you're the dinner party anecdote no one wants to be. Seating charts are another minefield. Where you sit depends not only on rank, but on proximity to power, lineage, marriage order, and, rumor has it, how much the Queen likes you. You may find yourself between a viscount and someone who owns 7 castles but has no speaking role, desperately trying to decode the correct fork to use and when exactly to say charmed. Staff are trained to enforce these rituals with gentle firmness. At state dinners, footmen wait for subtle cues, a lifted eyebrow, a lowered knife, to know when to begin service. In less formal settings, courtiers have been known to redirect entire seating plans because a cousin once removed accidentally took a chair meant for someone a shade more royal. These rules may seem trivial, but they aren't. They are the scaffolding of mystique, the illusion of timeless order built on who sits where, who bows when, and who dares speak out of turn. And in this hierarchy of control, there's one detail often overlooked. Even royals sometimes struggle with money, mortgages, and the quiet humiliation of bills. 33. The notion that some royals had to pay off mortgages or had odd debts. Though one normally thinks of them as above, that royalty, in public imagination, occupies a realm of effortless wealth. Castles appear fully paid off. Jewelry arrives without a bill. Servants materialize like helpful ghosts. And yet, behind the tapestry walls of aristocracy, the ledgers still hum. Because even monarchs, princes, and princesses occasionally find themselves tangled in the quiet, uncomfortable mathematics of debt. Historically, many members of the British royal family, particularly those not directly in line for the throne, have had to confront an awkward truth. The title doesn't always come with the money. While the sovereign is supported by state funding, others have to make do with allowances, inheritance, or, in some cases, property assets they can't quite afford to keep. There have been reports of royals quietly selling off family heirlooms or downgrading residences. One duke was revealed to have mortgaged a sprawling estate to cover taxes and repairs. Another royal was reportedly late on payments for staff wages, scandalous not because of the amount, but because it hinted that the monarchy, for all its grandeur, runs on budgets just like everyone else. Princess Margaret, despite her image of limitless glamour, once needed financial help from the Queen to keep her lifestyle afloat. Other minor royals have leased out sections of their homes or sold antiques from the family vaults. And let's not forget the royals who quietly rent out royal properties for events, weddings, film shoots, even corporate retreats. These moments reveal a different kind of royal reality, not one of unlimited luxury, but of strategic survival. Maintaining the appearance of wealth, it turns out, can be as expensive as actual wealth. And for a family raised on image, illusion, and inheritance, the idea of falling behind on bills feels almost taboo. But not nearly as taboo as what sometimes lands under the tree each Christmas. Gifts so strange they defy protocol, explanation, and, occasionally, good taste. 34. The gift giving. Quirks of royals, e.g., unusual objects, odd shapes, miniatures, novelty items. Christmas at Sandringham may be rigidly choreographed in every other way, from arrival times to dress codes. But when it comes to the royal gift exchange, all rules are gleefully thrown out the stained glass window. The royals, for all their titles and tiaras, have cultivated a tradition of giving one another gifts that are less Tiffany in coding and more novelty shop in Notting Hill. The goal? Be as absurd, cheeky, or outright ridiculous as possible. It's not just the Queen receiving Italian-accented pepper grinders or Prince Harry gifting shower caps with questionable slogans. The family is known to exchange miniature versions of household items, animal-shaped utensils, deliberately ugly trinkets, and gag presents that would look more at home at a student union white elephant party than a royal estate. One year, Princess Anne reportedly gave her brother, Charles, a leather toilet seat. He loved it so much he took it on royal tours. The tradition is rooted in the idea that when you have everything, the only way to surprise each other is to go sideways. The expected is boring. Diamonds are dull. A singing fish plaque? Now we're talking. These gifts are not grand. They're personal. They're inside jokes with a royal stamp. Even the Queen herself was said to join in with delight, presenting gifts that balanced humor with a sharp, dry wit. No one was spared, and everyone knew the real test wasn't in the cost of the gift, but in the creativity. How far could you push the joke without crossing the invisible line of decorum? And yet, these odd tokens echo something larger. That royalty is a life so formal, so bounded by protocol, that the rarest luxury is absurdity. A moment to be unserious, to be slightly ridiculous, or at the very least, to be playfully strange. Which leads naturally to the next mystery. Why do some royals, seemingly defined by dignity, act like mischievous children when seated around the dinner table? 35. The fact that sometimes royals have toy-like behavior or childish traditions, even though they appear stately. such as games at dinner, bread game example. For all the state dinners and silk gloves, there's a childish streak running just beneath the royal veneer, one that surfaces rather unexpectedly at the dinner table. Take Princess Margaret, for instance, whose infamous bread game became legend among the aristocratic dinner set. But it wasn't an isolated quirk. The royal table, especially in private, has long been a theater for play, subversion, and odd little traditions that suggest that even monarchs sometimes behave like prankish schoolchildren when they think no one is watching. The bread game worked like this. Every time someone at the table uttered a tired cliché or predictable pleasantry, "It's been such lovely weather. We must do this again soon," Margaret would theatrically tear a piece of bread in silence. Rip. Another platitude? Rip. It was her way of expressing her intolerance for dullness, with a side of passive aggression served on porcelain. Guests, as you can imagine, quickly found themselves speaking in short, nervous bursts. But beyond Margaret's particular brand of etiquette sabotage, the royals have long indulged in toy-like customs and inside jokes that carry on through generations. From secretive charade sessions at Balmoral to oddly competitive Christmas table games, many royal gatherings look less like state functions and more like eccentric boarding school reunions. Even during formal events, there are stories of whispered puns between princes, elaborate bets placed on speech timing, and once, allegedly, a race involving napkin folding techniques. These childish behaviors aren't accidents. They're carefully protected pockets of normalcy. After all, when your daily life involves scripted conversations and global scrutiny, the dinner table may be the only place where irreverence can still thrive. But if the table is a playground, then the guest list is a club, and some royal sets turn that club into an exclusive party circuit of their own. 36. A royal who had a set of friends in socialite high society that functioned almost like a club, being heavily followed by tabloids. Margaret's set. Long before Instagram followers and influencer squads, there was the Margaret set, a curated crew of aristocrats, artists, actors, and stylish provocateurs who orbited Princess Margaret in a swirl of velvet and cigarette smoke. This wasn't just a friend group. It was a lifestyle brand disguised as a social circle. They didn't just attend parties, they were the parties. The tabloids followed them obsessively. The court watched them warily. And Margaret, the royal at its center, thrived in this curated chaos. They met in glittering private clubs, dined in Mayfair's most exclusive spots, and holidayed in estates that felt more like film sets than homes. Their gatherings combined royal formality with beatnik nonchalance, black tie on top, scandal below. There was painter Lucian Freud, fashion designer Hardy Amies, playwright Noel Coward, each of them bringing a whiff of mischief, modernity, and gentle anarchy. For Margaret, the set was more than company. It was refuge, a space where she could escape the suffocating scrutiny of Buckingham Palace and reinvent herself as a modern, glamorous woman of the world, albeit one who also happened to be 11th in line to the throne. This club was endlessly dissected by the press. Every dinner was a potential scandal, every flirtation a national debate. But for all the scrutiny, the group maintained an elite intimacy, bound not just by fame, but by a shared disdain for convention. To outsiders, it looked like excess, but to Margaret, it was something closer to oxygen. Where her sister had duty, she had style. Where the monarchy had tradition, she had taste. And speaking of lineage and taste, some royals didn't stop at parties. They made bold declarations about their ancestry that turned heads across drawing rooms and dinner tables alike. 37. The story of unusual ancestry or lineage statements by a royal. See Princess Michael of Kent's comment about royal blood in her veins. In the realm of royalty, bloodlines are not just metaphors. They're currency, identity, and status rolled into one. But every so often, a royal pushes the narrative a little too far, turning pride in ancestry into something closer to self-parody. Few have done this with as much flair or as much controversy as Princess Michael of Kent. Princess Michael, born Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz, once famously claimed to have more royal blood in her veins than the queen herself. A statement that, even by aristocratic standards, was bold to the point of theatrical. Technically, she wasn't wrong, depending on which centuries and European minor monarchies one wants to include on the family tree. She is descended from several strands of European royalty, particularly from the Habsburgs and various branches of minor German aristocracy. But the sheer confidence with which she delivered the claim turned heads, and not always admiringly. In the context of the modern monarchy, where public approval matters more than royal DNA, her comment felt like something transported from the 18th century, minus the powdered wig. The remark resurfaced multiple times in tabloids, especially during periods when Princess Michael's behavior already invited criticism. Her penchant for opulent fashion, haughty airs, and a few tone-deaf public gaffes didn't help her cause. But perhaps more interesting than the claim itself was what it revealed about a certain kind of aristocratic nostalgia, a longing for a time when bloodlines really did shape power, and where superiority could be charted like genealogy spreadsheets. In today's monarchy, where humility is now a desirable royal trait, such statements feel like a relic, but they also serve as reminders. Beneath the PR training and press releases, the fantasy of divine ancestry still lingers. And speaking of fantasy, nothing blurred the line between privilege and indulgence quite like the overlap of aristocratic nightlife and the so-called royal responsibilities that happen to include cocktails at dawn. 38. The weird overlap of aristocratic nightlife and royal life, late nights, clubs, cars, in decades past, when one assumed royal equals always proper. The image of royalty is supposed to be one of restraint, duty, and quiet elegance. But somewhere in the velvet-draped back rooms of 1960s London, that idea was repeatedly and joyously set on fire. In the decades when tradition still wrapped itself around the monarchy like a corset, the younger royals and their aristocratic cousins were busy slipping out the back door and into the city's club scene, with martinis in hand and reputations left behind. This was an era when the lines between royalty and aristocracy blurred after dark. High society wasn't content to simply attend garden parties anymore. They wanted to dance until sunrise, preferably with someone scandalous. The Sloane Rangers of the 1980s were perhaps the most obvious successors to this trend, a generation of posh socialites, some with titles, others with trust funds, who made clubbing into a contact sport. They mingled with royals, dated them, partied with them, and occasionally gave the press its favorite scandals. Places like Annabelle's, Tramp, and Bougie's weren't just clubs. They were unofficial royal annexes. It wasn't unusual to see a viscount on the dance floor next to a minor princess, both pretending tomorrow's headlines didn't exist. For the press, it was a gold mine. For palace staff, a headache. And for the royals themselves, it was freedom, however fleeting. This culture of aristocratic nightlife also revealed a curious truth. For all their power and wealth, royals often envied the semi-detached freedom of the aristocracy. The titled nobodies could misbehave with fewer consequences. Royals? They just did it more carefully, or with more plausible deniability. And yet, as these late nights rolled into early mornings, a different kind of unease settled over their ancestral homes. Because while the clubs were loud and glamorous, the palaces, well, some say they were never truly empty. 39. Old royal houses. Having ghost stories and caretakers' tales of supernatural appearances. It's difficult to walk the creaking floors of a centuries-old royal residence without wondering who, or what, might still be there. In Britain's most storied palaces and castles, ghost stories are not just late-night gossip. They're part of the architectural memory, passed down from caretaker to butler, from tour guide to monarch. The official stance? Quiet skepticism. The unofficial truth? Too many strange occurrences to write off entirely. Take Windsor Castle. arguably one of the most haunted places in the UK. Staff have long claimed that the ghost of Henry VIII roams its halls, particularly around the cloisters, where heavy footsteps are said to echo long after the corridor is empty. Some say he groans. Others say he drags his leg. All agree that he doesn't knock. Then there's the spectral presence of Elizabeth I, often spotted gliding silently through the library. She's not angry, they say, just watchful, observing, judging, as she did in life, only with slightly more dramatic entrances now. Staff have reported sudden drops in temperature, unexplained candle flickers, and the distinct sound of someone walking just behind them. At Sandringham House, the royal Christmas residence, things reportedly go bump in the very early hours. Guests and staff have told of hearing voices in rooms they swore were empty, doors opening slowly without anyone near them, and a persistent feeling of being observed, particularly in the drawing rooms after midnight. Even Balmoral, the Queen's favorite Scottish retreat, has had reports of ghostly sightings, including the occasional mention of Queen Victoria's presence, still lingering as though waiting for a husband who died over a century ago. Whether these tales are the product of imagination, old pipes, or something else entirely, one thing's certain. You don't spend centuries storing secrets and sorrow in a stone building without something lingering. And yet, amid the shadows and whispers, one royal preferred horsepower of a very different kind, the kind that required a license and nerves of steel. 40. The idea that some royals had license to drive HGVs or carried unusual licenses. Princess Anne again, HGV license. If there's one royal who consistently zigged where others zagged, it's Princess Anne. While her siblings and cousins were busy perfecting the art of waving from carriages and appearing appropriately solemn in tweed, Anne was behind the wheel of something entirely different, a heavy goods vehicle. Yes, the Princess Royal, known for her no-frills demeanor and clear allergy to nonsense, once obtained an HGV license. Because of course she did. Driving for Anne was never a novelty. It wasn't a photo op or a quirky hobby trotted out for PR. It was practicality, wrapped in engine grease and steely competence. The license wasn't just for show. She actually used it. On occasion, she would drive horse boxes herself to equestrian events, opting to handle the trailer, the gear, and the parking herself, rather than rely on a staff of handlers. No fuss, no ceremony, just horsepower and a royal in boots. This choice did more than just raise eyebrows. It shattered an unspoken image. Royals weren't meant to be capable in this way. They were meant to glide, to be chauffeured, to be separate. Anne's HGV license felt like a quiet declaration. I am not a decorative object, and she wasn't alone in her vehicular independence. Other royals, like Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth herself, were famously fond of driving, but Anne took it further. She didn't just want to drive, she wanted to qualify. It's a small detail, perhaps, but it cuts through the pageantry. A princess with an HGV license reminds us that sometimes, beneath the titles and tiaras, there are people who just want to take the wheel. Which makes it all the more ironic that in the same royal households, even the corgis were more pampered than most humans could imagine. 41. Unusual pets of royals, e.g. corgis of the Queen, though that is better known, but fits, weird habits. Few things are more synonymous with Queen Elizabeth II than her beloved corgis, a waddling, yapping, biscuit-demanding entourage that padded alongside her from childhood to her final years. But these were not just pets. They were, in a sense, furry courtiers, treated with the kind of reverence normally reserved for minor nobility. The Queen received her first corgi, Susan, as a gift for her 18th birthday. Susan became the matriarch of a royal dynasty that would span over 30 dogs, each descended from the original. These weren't simply house pets lounging about on tartan cushions. They had their own room, their own menu, their own chef. Meals were prepared daily by palace kitchen staff, typically including diced meat, vegetables, rice, and the occasional luxury like rabbit or liver, cooked and served warm. Feeding time was regimented, with a butler present to supervise. The queen herself was reportedly involved in overseeing their diets and disciplining them personally when necessary. But it wasn't just the corgis who enjoyed royal treatment. Other monarchs throughout history have had equally strange companions. King George III had a passion for spaniels. Queen Victoria's favorite pet was a Pomeranian named Turi. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a cousin of Charles I, took his white hunting poodle Boy into battle, where it allegedly developed a reputation as a kind of supernatural mascot. The Queen's corgis, however, were uniquely visible, appearing in portraits, on royal tours, and most famously, in the James Bond sketch for the 2012 Olympics, where they trotted down the red carpet like seasoned diplomats. It was all delightfully absurd. Monarchs surrounded by dignitaries, jewels, and constitutional paperwork, making room on the bed for a dog with a better pedigree than most prime ministers. And yet, the absurdity doesn't stop at dogs. Sometimes it shuffles in, wearing tuxedos, and joins a high-stakes card game run by a future king. 42. The idea of playing high-stakes card games with the heir as dealer in a country house party setting with scandalous outcome, the baccarat scandal. Picture this: a long dining table in a candlelit country estate. The air smells of tobacco, French perfume, and inherited entitlement. Guests are draped in pearls and polished scandal. And at the head of the table, dealing cards with the composure of someone far too used to attention, sits the Prince of Wales, future King Edward VII, banking a high-stakes game of baccarat. It sounds like a scene from an Edwardian drama, but it happened. This wasn't Vegas. This was Tranby Croft in 1890, and the stakes weren't just money, they were reputation, lineage, and the unwritten rules of aristocratic secrecy. The presence of the heir to the throne as both participant and dealer lent the game a veneer of legitimacy and danger. Baccarat, already frowned upon by polite society, was being played under the royal eye. When Sir William Gordon Cumming won repeatedly and suspiciously, guests began to whisper. By the end of the weekend, a quiet conspiracy had formed. He was confronted, forced to sign a letter agreeing never to play again. In return, the incident would be buried. It was not buried. It was exhumed and paraded in court, with the prince himself called as a witness. The entire affair became a media circus. Aristocratic dignity collapsed under cross-examination. Gordon Cumming's name was ruined. Edward's remained intact, but the stench of scandal lingered, reminding the nation that even royals can gamble more than they realize. What makes the story so fascinating isn't just the cheating. It's the setting. A country house turned casino. Titles on the line over a pack of cards. It was an empire, folding ever so slightly at the corners. And long after the cards were cleared and reputations reshuffled, another game was being played. This time with cameras, shutters, and the constant war between private lives and public snapshots. 43. The strange rules around photographs, paparazzi, and private versus public life for royals, especially modern era. In the age of image, few people are as simultaneously visible and hidden as the modern royal family. Every smile, wave, and carefully angled pose is a calculated performance. And yet behind the curtain, the real battle isn't just about what gets seen. It's about who gets to choose what should be seen. Photographs, once rare and formal artifacts of monarchy, are now the front lines of a quiet war between privacy and expectation. The modern era introduced something older monarchs never had to reckon with: the paparazzi. Not state photographers, not official portrait artists, but a swarm of long-lensed freelancers willing to climb trees, sit in cars, or camp outside hospitals just to get that unsanctioned shot of a royal in jeans buying carrots. There's a famous story of Queen Elizabeth gently scolding a photographer for snapping shots through the Balmoral trees. He reportedly didn't move, unsure whether her scolding was a formality or a command. It was both. The family has always tried to maintain a wall between their private and public selves. But the line has become blurred, especially in the 21st century. Official engagements are highly curated, with specific rules: no touching without permission, no flash unless approved, and often no candid shots at all. Staff will remind event attendees, subtly or not, to put phones away. Royal security is trained not only to protect physical safety, but also to manage optics. Then there's the question of social media, a realm where the royals have reluctantly begun to participate, though never without a team of professionals holding the digital keys. Posts are scheduled, polished, and scrubbed clean of anything remotely spontaneous. And yet, the chaos of the public lens remains. It follows them through every gate, especially when something goes wrong, like an abduction attempt, a crash, or an unscheduled escape from protocol. Which leads us directly into one of the most astonishing moments of royal defiance: a princess, a pistol, and a phrase that echoed like a thunderclap down the mall. 44. A royal being unexpectedly involved in or witness to a violent crime. Kidnapping attempt on Princess Anne. It was 1974, and Princess Anne, known for her unshakable calm and disdain for fuss, found herself at the center of one of the most audacious crimes in modern royal history. As she returned from a charity event with her husband, Captain Mark Phillips, their car was halted on the Mall in central London by a vehicle swerving violently into its path. Out stepped a man with a gun. His intent? Kidnap the princess and demand a multi-million-pound ransom from the crown. But this wasn't a scene from a film. It was real, and it unfolded with chaotic swiftness. The gunman, later identified as Ian Ball, shot the royal chauffeur and a passing journalist who attempted to intervene. He tried to open the royal car door, only to be met not with panic, but with the unimpressed steeliness of Princess Anne herself. According to multiple eyewitnesses, Ball ordered her to get out. She refused, firmly, repeatedly. When he insisted, her now famous reply cut through the moment like a blade. Not bloody likely. It wasn't royal speak. It was pure Anne, deadpan, unmoved, completely unimpressed by armed theatrics. Eventually, Ball was tackled and arrested. Anne was unharmed. The entire encounter lasted minutes, but became an enduring legend of royal grit. In an institution where most scandals involve too much wine or too little discretion, this was something entirely different. Actual danger, real bravery, and a reaction so characteristically blunt that it almost seemed scripted. It also exposed a weakness: the vulnerability of public royals in a world where their schedules are public, their routes predictable, and their vehicles, until then, lightly protected. After the incident, royal security underwent a quiet revolution. But bravery aside, what's most memorable is Anne's tone. The same tone she'd later apply to everything from hairbrushes to horse trailers to refusing palace chauffeurs. And that refusal to follow script? It was echoed across the royal spectrum in the oddest, most unexpected ways. 45. The concept that the royals sometimes break from tradition in unexpected ways, e.g., odd hobbies, license to drive, ignored protocol. Despite the polished image, the British royal family has a long tradition of low-key rule-breaking, not in the revolutionary sense, but in the quietly subversive acts that chip away at royal stereotypes. Behind the medals and manners, there are royals who drive themselves, dress out of step, or collect objects that would confuse Sotheby's and delight a flea market. We've seen Princess Anne behind the wheel of an HGV, Prince Philip fixing Land Rover engines well into his 90s, the Queen riding horses without a helmet, decades after most people decided it was a good idea. These aren't just personality quirks, they're acts of rebellion within the palace bubble, a way of saying, we may be royal, but we're still real. Queen Elizabeth was particularly fond of breaking from expected norms in quiet, almost sly ways. Her fondness for Tupperware at breakfast, her use of a jigsaw puzzle to unwind, and her collection of novelty pepper grinders all suggested a monarch who knew how to play the role but didn't always want to live it. These were not grand acts of insurrection, but they were revealing ones. Prince Harry's military service in Afghanistan, under a pseudonym and in active combat zones, was one of the more serious examples. It was tradition-breaking not just because of the risk, but because it represented a royal stepping directly into the world they were usually shielded from. Even sartorial choices sometimes make headlines. Royals breaking dress codes, laughing too loudly, dancing in public. These moments are small, but they matter. Because every time a royal acts a little bit human, the mythology wobbles, and the public sees the person behind the persona. But the palace isn't the only place where strange things happen. Sometimes it's the staff below stairs, the ones you never see, who host the weirdest events of all. 46. The idea of late-night parties behind palace walls. By staff, though more about staff than royals themselves. Still touches the weird royal ecosystem. While the public often imagines palace life as a solemn rotation of state dinners, crown polishing, and well-behaved corgis, the truth behind the scenes can be far more raucous, especially when the royals have gone to bed. For decades, palace staff have quietly sustained their own shadow culture, complete with nicknames, traditions, and yes, late-night parties behind royal walls. These gatherings weren't exactly raves, but they were spirited affairs nonetheless. Junior footmen, kitchen hands, housemaids, and equerries, once the queen had turned in and the official business was locked behind polished mahogany, would descend into the staff quarters for makeshift socials. Laughter echoed down stone hallways, music leaked faintly through centuries-old walls, wine flowed from mismatched glasses borrowed from less regal cupboards, and all of it unfolded beneath chandeliers that had witnessed centuries of monarchy. One of the more whispered traditions was the Christmas shift party at Sandringham, an unofficial event where the night staff celebrated in their own way, often including absurd gift exchanges, improvised skits about the royals, strictly off the record, and impromptu dancing in rooms usually reserved for silverware inventory. While technically discouraged, these parties were tolerated, even quietly respected. After all, the staff who ran the palaces did so with military efficiency. If the under-butler wanted to belt out a karaoke version of God Save the Queen with ironic flair, so be it. And sometimes it wasn't just staff in attendance. A younger royal might accidentally wander into the festivities under the pretense of checking the time. These rare overlaps between crown and caretakers were fleeting but unforgettable. These parties are proof of the strange duality of palace life, at once ceremonial and deeply human. And in these quiet rebellions, the monarchy feels less distant, especially when the Queen's novelty pepper grinder makes a surprise appearance on the staff buffet table. Because if there's one thing royalty does best after rituals and robes, it's giving away the oddest gifts you've ever seen. 47. Tales of gifts or souvenirs from the royals that sound whimsical or trivial. Pepper grinder novelty. If diamonds are the official language of diplomacy, then the unofficial one, the one that speaks volumes between royals and their closest circle, is novelty. Because when you're surrounded by priceless heirlooms and centuries-old portraits, nothing says "I see you" quite like a plastic singing bass or a pepper grinder that screams in a caricatured Italian accent. By now, Queen Elizabeth II's peculiar fondness for quirky gifts is part of royal folklore. Among the most delightful, a pepper mill that exclaimed, "Mamma Mia," when turned. It was reportedly given to her during a casual visit to an Italian restaurant and, rather than being discarded or hidden away in the royal archives, it found a place in her private collection, treasured for its absurdity and charm. But the pepper grinder was just the tip of the novelty iceberg. Other items in the Queen's personal trove included ceramic animals with no known function, wind-up toys shaped like corgis, and tiny utensils designed to serve exactly one olive. These weren't diplomatic gifts. They were the results of decades of family in-jokes, accidental public encounters, and the kind of eccentric humor that develops when one lives in a literal castle. Royals have gifted each other ridiculous objects as a matter of tradition. Prince Harry gave his grandmother a shower cap that read, "Ain't life a royal pain?" One royal reportedly gave another a grow-your-own Earl gardening kit. Princess Margaret was known to hand out framed photos of herself, with elaborate, sometimes sarcastic inscriptions. These gifts tell you something vital. That even the most stoic monarchs have a private world of silliness, tucked just beneath the tiara. And just when you think that world is entirely composed of duty and dignity, you peek behind the throne and realize there are games being played, not political ones, literal ones, with corgis, cutlery, and cocktails. 48. The idea that what seems stately and proper still houses weird rituals, odd games, and eccentric individuals. The public-facing image of the British monarchy is an exquisite illusion. Gloved hands, practiced smiles, and speeches that sound like they were edited by time itself. But behind that velvet curtain lies a world much stranger. A parallel court filled not with pageantry, but with eccentricity, quiet absurdity, and rituals so odd they could pass for performance art. Palace insiders have long whispered about the odd games that take place behind royal doors. Not just Margaret's legendary bread game, where dull guests were punished with silent carbohydrate judgment, but other lesser-known diversions. Like a game involving who could invent the most absurd nickname for a visiting dignitary. The Queen Mother apparently excelled at this. Or timed charades sessions during the holidays, where even the most senior royals dropped their titles in favor of outrageous impressions. At Balmoral, the royal estate in Scotland, the family is known to participate in fiercely competitive board games and late-night quizzes, often moderated by staff with straight faces and subtle side bets on who might flip the board first. Guests unfamiliar with the tradition have been caught off guard by the sight of a future king arguing passionately over a game of Scrabble, or a duchess attempting to bluff her way through a round of Trivial Pursuit. Even more curious are the private traditions passed from one generation to the next, specific toasts made in half Latin, joke honors awarded for service to the djinn, and annual costume dinners where the themes are obscure and the execution is, at best, deeply inconsistent. These aren't the things captured by the press. They're not on display at state openings or jubilee celebrations, but they're essential to the monarchy's inner workings, a reminder that behind the protocol and poise live people who are, in the end, still very strange. And as the strangeness persists, so too do the claims about bloodlines, lineage, and ancestry so peculiar they almost demand a family tree built from folklore. 49. A royal making an unusual public remark about the press or ancestry, e.g., Princess Michael of Kent's lineage claims. Among the constellation of minor royals orbiting the British throne, few have delivered quite as many sound bites with raised eyebrows attached as Princess Michael of Kent. Known in the press alternately as Princess Pushy and that royal who always says the quiet part loud, she has become something of a curiosity not just for her taste in elaborate jewelry and Baroque interior design, but for her astonishingly candid comments about her ancestry and the media. Princess Michael, born Baroness Marie Christine von Reibnitz, is married to Prince Michael of Kent, a first cousin of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Though she holds no formal role within the working royal family, she has long styled herself with the confidence of someone who very much would like one. Her public persona is a blend of old-school European aristocracy and unfiltered bluntness, a combination that makes every public statement feel like it might derail into either diplomatic incident or dinner party scandal. Take her much-quoted declaration that she has more royal blood in her veins than anyone in the royal family. It's the kind of remark that would be easy to dismiss as hyperbole if she didn't deliver it with absolute conviction. Tracing her lineage to a dizzying web of minor German and Austro-Hungarian royals, she once elaborated on this point by asserting that she descended from Charlemagne and half the royal houses of Europe. Technically, she's not entirely wrong. Many aristocratic families do interconnect if you go far back enough, but the delivery carried a level of smug grandeur usually reserved for operatic villains or particularly confident antique dealers. But it wasn't just ancestry that landed her in headlines. Her relationship with the press has often veered between frosty and provocative. In interviews, she has lamented the media's portrayal of her, suggesting with a kind of backhanded grace that she was too refined, too European, and too misunderstood by the British tabloid machine. At one point, she remarked that the British press was obsessed with tearing people down, noting that her own statements were often taken out of context by journalists who, she implied, lacked the intellectual depth to appreciate her historical references. Of course, by taken out of context, she often meant quoted verbatim. But that's part of the mystique. Princess Michael doesn't so much court controversy as behave as if controversy is a natural byproduct of being terribly interesting. Even her home decor has made headlines. Think leopards, gilded mirrors, and an unapologetic love for all things rococo. When asked once about her famously opulent style, she replied, "People say my taste is over the top. I say, what's wrong with a bit of drama?" This, in a way, explains everything. She sees herself as a character in a grand royal play, misunderstood by modern audiences. And perhaps she is. In an era when most royals are trained in the art of saying very little very carefully, Princess Michael says a great deal very unapologetically. She is, at once, a walking relic of royal Europe, a headline generator, and the kind of person who would absolutely describe her own blood as blue without a hint of irony. But for all her claims about royal lineage and misunderstood nobility, she shares one fate with every Windsor in the modern era, being relentlessly followed, prodded, photographed, and pursued by the long lenses of the media. And nowhere does that battle between royalty and intrusion play out more vividly than in the surreal world of paparazzi mishaps, phone hacking, and very public private moments. 50. A royal having to deal with media intrusion, paparazzi hacking, and weird pranks. Modern era. In the golden age of royal mystery, the public might have known what the monarch wore to church, but not what she ate for breakfast. There were no leaked voicemails, no covert photos from bathroom windows, no off-the-record whispers captured and sold for clicks. But with the rise of modern tabloid culture and the evolution of press from printing house to paparazzi swarm, the boundaries around royal privacy began to evaporate like fog over Balmoral. From the 1990s onward, the media's appetite for royal content ballooned from curiosity to obsession. What once appeared as painted portraits and staged balcony appearances now flooded tabloids in the form of candid snapshots, leaked conversations, and moments that were never meant for public consumption. The lives of British royals became a permanent live stream, often without their consent. Take the phone hacking scandals of the early 2000s. Several members of the royal family, including Prince William and Prince Harry, were confirmed targets of illegal surveillance by tabloid journalists. Private voicemails, sometimes mundane, sometimes deeply personal, were accessed, recorded, and in some cases, quoted. The invasion was so severe it sparked criminal investigations, high-profile lawsuits, and a reckoning across the media industry. But even beyond the criminal, the everyday intrusions were constant. Prince William once confronted paparazzi hiding in the bushes outside a private estate, lens poking through leaves like a cartoon villain. Princess Diana, perhaps the most hunted woman on earth in her time, was chased through streets and cornered in parking garages, her expressions immortalized in the flash of 1,000 cameras. Even the Queen wasn't exempt. One anecdote recalls her being surprised by a long-lens photographer while walking alone at Balmoral. She was reportedly not angry, just weary. A soft rebuke, a glance. The photographer got the message. For a while. Then there are the weirder moments. Royals have been the targets of prank calls, some harmless, others humiliating. Impersonators have bluffed their way into palace switchboards. During one famous episode, a nurse answered a prank call from someone pretending to be the Queen. It made international news. No one laughed. The family has tried to adapt. They've embraced controlled social media, hired tighter security, instituted stricter protocols for public access. But the core paradox remains. To be royal is to be visible. Yet that very visibility makes privacy feel like a forgotten luxury. And so they continue to walk the tightrope, smiling on balconies, then retreating into fortresses where even the wallpaper might be watching. Because while the world watches them for perfection, it's the flashes of normality, of imperfection, that truly capture attention. Like the moments when a royal lights a cigarette at noon, pours a vodka, and becomes, for a fleeting second, unsettlingly ordinary. 51. The odd mix of everyday human habits. Driving, smoking, vodka at noon. Within the royal lives of high protocol. One of the most enduring illusions about monarchy is that it exists above the ordinary, that a sovereign's hands are too delicate for dish soap, their mornings too sacred for hangovers, their evenings too stately for second helpings. And yet, nestled between centuries of ritual and acres of manicured gardens, the royal family continues to harbor the most delightfully mundane human habits imaginable. Princess Margaret, of course, takes center stage here. Her routine, outlined in previous tales but always worth revisiting, began not with meetings or correspondence, but with cigarettes and toast in bed. Mid-morning was reserved for leisurely bathing. Lunchtime, often accompanied by vodka. And not in hushed secrecy either. This was just how she operated, as casually as a duchess reading the paper in curlers. But Margaret was not alone in her indulgences. Prince Philip, ever the engineer at heart, would sneak off to tinker with his Land Rover engines, while staff gently tried not to interrupt. Queen Elizabeth herself was famously fond of her afternoon Dubonnet and gin, served in the same glass, with the same ratio, every time. A drink not offered in opulent surroundings, but quietly sipped in private rooms while dogs shuffled around her ankles. Even Prince Charles, now King Charles III, has habits that would baffle an outsider. He travels with his own linen, his own glassware. His breakfast preferences are so precise they require a laminated instruction sheet. It's not that he's demanding, it's that monarchy, for all its scale, is still deeply personal. When the world insists on control, small routines become your last stand of individuality. And that's what makes these details fascinating. Not that royals smoke or drink or drive themselves to a field on a foggy Tuesday, but that they do so while representing an institution that pretends, at all costs, not to exhale. The tension between protocol and personhood isn't a crack in the system, it is the system. Which makes every puff of smoke, every crumpled map in the glove compartment, and every clink of glass at an odd hour feel like a rare peek behind the curtain. Not into scandal, but into something even more elusive. Reality. 52. The fact that many traditions around the royals are so old, they seem bizarre today. Door-opening rules, handshake rules, etc. Step into the world of British royalty, and you step into a parallel dimension where time, it seems, forgot to move on. Not entirely, of course. The palaces have central heating now, and the corgis are occasionally captured in high definition, but many of the rituals, rules, and unspoken expectations that shape royal life appear to be preserved in amber. Amber with very clean cutlery and historically significant wallpaper. Some of these traditions, viewed from the outside, border on the surreal. The door-opening rule, for instance. When the monarch is present, no other royal or staff member may open a door ahead of them. It's not about practicality, it's about symbolism. The monarch leads, quite literally. If you reach for the doorknob too soon, you're not just being helpful, you're threatening the very fabric of the hierarchical universe. Dramatic? Perhaps. But in royal protocol, symbolic gestures matter more than function. Then there are handshake rules. You don't offer your hand to a royal. You wait for them to extend theirs. If they do, you may shake it, briefly, without squeezing, and certainly without the kind of two-handed clasp typically reserved for long-lost relatives or job interviews. It's not coldness, it's choreography. There are rules for walking. You walk beside, never ahead of, a senior royal, unless directed otherwise. You don't sit until the monarch sits. You don't eat until they start. If they stop eating, you stop eating. And if you were really hoping for another bite of pudding, well, bad luck. Etiquette waits for no appetite. Even conversation follows invisible guidelines. The first address must be formal. Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, before descending into ma'am or sir as the interaction continues. It's a bit like a dance where everyone knows the steps except the new guests, who are silently judged by centuries of portraits on the wall. These traditions are not enforced by law. No one will be arrested for slipping up. But they are guarded fiercely by the courtiers, private secretaries, and ceremonial aides who act as custodians of the mystique. To break a rule is to rupture the illusion that the monarchy is not just an institution, but a timeless one. What makes all this so bizarre today is not just that the rules exist, but that they still matter. In a world of smartphones and casual Fridays, the idea that someone might be reprimanded for entering a room too early feels like something out of a historical drama. And yet the monarchy thrives on such details. It's the rigidity that keeps the mystery alive. And within that mystery, some royals choose to play along, while others quietly rebel. Sometimes by skipping the chauffeur, sometimes by brushing their own hair, and sometimes by doing both before breakfast. Which brings us to one of the quietest yet most telling revolutions in the royal household. When a royal insists on doing things themselves in a world built to make sure they never have to lift a finger. 53. A royal who underlined the idea of, I'll do it myself in a system built for them to never have to, e.g., Princess Anne. Doing her own hair, driving, etc. In a palace designed to pamper, where even shoelaces are occasionally ironed, and someone somewhere holds the official title of Warden of the Silverware, doing something yourself is considered, well, unusual, almost rebellious. But Princess Anne, as ever, has never been interested in doing things the usual way. In fact, if she had a personal motto, it might well be, I'll handle it. Princess Anne has long been the monarchy's iron-willed minimalist. While others in the family are trailed by stylists, security details, and a rotating cast of personal assistants, Anne is more likely to be found behind the wheel of her own car, brushing her own hair in a modest suite, and reviewing her own itinerary with a biro, not a royal equerry. It's not a performance. It's not even eccentricity. It's just how she prefers things. She reportedly does her own hair, yes, the iconic lacquered beehive that hasn't shifted since the 1970s. While others spend hours with stylists and specialists, Anne does it herself, quickly, efficiently, and without complaint. There's something both admirable and slightly terrifying about that kind of discipline. It's hair as battle armor. She also drives herself, to engagements, to horse trials, even to diplomatic events. Not because there isn't a fleet of blacked-out cars and trained chauffeurs at her disposal, but because she can. And more importantly, because she wants to. There's a stubbornness in her independence, a quiet rejection of the notion that royalty must always glide, never walk. This attitude extends beyond logistics. Anne is known for carrying her own bags, making her own notes, and often skipping the photo ops entirely. She has no interest in being adored or adored at. Her version of public service is deeply unglamorous, consisting of endless ribbon cuttings, agricultural fairs, and briefings that don't make headlines but do make a difference. And in a world where image is curated within an inch of its life, Anne's refusal to be fussed over feels almost radical. She doesn't need a spotlight. She needs a sturdy pair of boots, a reliable vehicle, and preferably a route with minimal traffic. Her quiet practicality doesn't reject royalty. It redefines it. It suggests that power need not be ornamental. That duty, when stripped of vanity, is still noble. That perhaps the most royal thing one can do is to quietly insist, I've got it. In the end, Princess Anne is a paradox in pearls, simultaneously the most traditional and most modern royal of them all. A woman who respects the crown, but doesn't need a footman to hand her the keys. And with her, our gallery of royal strangeness comes to a close, not with a scandal, but with a shrug and a gear shift. Because sometimes, the weirdest thing a royal can do is act normal. And that's what makes them endlessly fascinating.